Hopefully you've met someone new today, and we love for people to meet engineering people, to meet arts people, to meet people from staff, from faculty, from students. So this is a great place and idea to do that. So thank you for all for coming today. My name is Rebecca Pearl-Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Sustainability here at Boston University. I'm standing in for Ali Gold, who just got back from a vacation in Japan and got a bug. So she couldn't be here today. Who's doing a lot of the leadership with our team, especially with Laura Hurley, Siri, and Mariam. Our whole team has been really engaged in organizing this. So thank you to all of those people. So on behalf of our team, I want to thank you so much for being here. We love seeing this room full, and we're going to be doing a lot more of this in 2026, filling this room on a regular basis across the disciplines. The climate crisis really requires all institutions, but especially universities like ours, to tackle the problem from many different diverse angles. So IGS convenes faculty across as diverse as engineering, natural sciences, public health, law, social science, and most importantly for today's talk, insights we can learn from researchers at the College of Communication, or in general, communication researchers from anywhere across Boston or the nation. And Michelle Amazeen is one of our beloved core faculty, exemplifying IGS's commitment to research with real-world impact. We started working together as part of BU's Climate Disinformation Initiative. They have a fantastic team. A lot of those people are in the room here today. And now we're honored to welcome Michelle here today to discuss her powerful new book, Content and Confusion, which explores how mainstream media contributes to climate disinformation through the covert practice of native advertising. And nothing could be more important in these times to talk about this. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for the event. So College of Communication, the School of Law, and the Ravi K. Mehrotra Institute for Business, Markets, and Society. Also, that team is here today, so I hope you can all meet them. Marcel, you're here, and I saw Susan and over here. Okay, so people from Western are here as well. So it's a new institute. Please go talk to them as well after this. And then a special thank you as well to our very esteemed moderator, Jill Abramson, who's joining us from the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern. Thank you, Jill, for being here with us. It's very special to us. With that, I'd like to invite Arunima Krishna to deliver some opening remarks. Arunima is one of our faculty associate directors here at IGS, one of Michelle's colleagues and long-term research collaborators in the College of Communication. She is an associate professor of mass communication, advertising, and public relations, and the college's associate dean for faculty development. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you and welcome to what promises to be an excellent discussion. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce you to our panelists today. So first is my colleague and dear friend, Michelle Amazeen, Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Research at the College of Communication. Michelle is an internationally recognized expert on native advertising. Now, many of you may be thinking, what is native advertising? Well, we have an answer for you. We have an example of a native ad right here. Native advertising refers to a piece of sponsored content, paid content, that appears on a mainstream traditional news medium, and it is deliberately designed to look and feel and read like the news content of that particular medium. So as you can see here, this is an article. If you scroll down, it's a full, feature-length article on the future of energy. But if you look at this really tiny, tiny post right under the banner, it says paid post. So this is an example of a native ad. And what is even more problematic often is that these ads are created by in-house content studios of that particular medium. So for example, the New York Times has the T-brand studio that created this particular ad. And often these kinds of deals also come with distribution and promotional deals for the content, where reporters and the social channels of that particular mainstream medium are required to promote that content. And so you can see how that content, this kind of thing, might just be a little bit problematic for a fragmented and more distrusted mainstream news media. Michelle's new book lays out the historical and economic factors that led us to this moment. and teases out how mainstream news contributes to the distribution and legitimization and amplification of disinformation, leading to content confusion. Leading our discussion with Michelle today on her book is Jill Abramson, who leads the Burns Center's initiative on investigative solutions journalism. She is a journalist who spent 17 years in the most senior editorial positions at the New York Times, which is why we put up an ad, a native ad from the New York Times, where she was the first woman to serve as Washington bureau chief, managing editor, and executive editor. So please join me in welcoming Michelle and Jill.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Michelle, I found, your book fascinating and disturbing at the same time. And fascinating because I dealt with so many of the issues you write about so compellingly, including native advertising. But I'm curious, here's a whole book about it. What made you write a book about this subject?
So this has been something I've been looking at for probably a decade now. And I guess what gave me the idea for the book, I had somebody on a listserv had posted a question about warning labels, disclosure labels, and I was doing research on this at that point. And I responded to the post, and I said, okay, well, here's some things that I found. And then somebody else responded and said, is this all you have to say about it? Or do you think that you have more to say and it could become a book? So that was the first that was 2019.
From question directly to book. It's a short way.
Yeah, well, it took a while to get into the book, but that's what planted the seed. And then when I was writing the book about trying to pull together all my research and other people who have reported on this issue, I was nearing the end of writing the manuscript. And this was, I think, fall of 2023. I had assigned my students to write a paper on young people's news consumption. And when I was grading the paper, some of the citations looked weird. And I think we actually have an example of this if we want to put this up. So one of the citations said the in-text citation said person. And I thought, wow, that's really a coincidence that this author's last name is Person. I looked, they did have the reference on there. I clicked through and it brought me to this. And so seemingly, this is a Wall Street Journal article about digital social media power, Gen Z teens news consumption. So about how young people are consuming news. But I had to keep scrolling up and down. There's no author byline until I realized at the top in the banner that says CMO Today, content by Deloitte. This is a native ad. My college students, not just one, several of them have come across this native ad and were citing it in their academic report. So
citing it because they thought it's just another article.
Exactly. So that's when I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening, A, and B, I need to put this in my book. So this is one of the opening anecdotes in the book.
Definitely could cause confusion way beyond your students. And in the paid posts from the Times that was shown just earlier, I fought tooth and nail against IDing what are native ads, often on the homepage of the Times website, like paid post. What is paid post? I wanted advertising to be in the cover line. Because I thought it could create the kind of confusion that's in that Wall Street Journal ad. I know I had many battles. I was only on the news side of the Times, and we had a whole business side and a very large advertising department. But I had many battles with the business side during the time I was executive editor, the top job. The Times was challenged in terms of its revenues. All kinds of advertising was cratering. And we had a new CEO who was desperate to try to see if native advertising and having these paid posts would boost our weakening revenues. And I fought it for quite a while. And then he came into my office and he looked me in the eye. He just said, I need this from you. And, I knew at that point saying no, saying no, there was no point. But I saw it as clearly a step more drastic towards creating confusion between advertising and news. And what are your thoughts on that? Can you explain content confusion?
Yeah, well, content confusion, the name actually derives from another scholar, Mara Einstein, who actually wrote the foreword to my book. She used the word in her 2016 book, Black Ops Advertising. And so I adopted it. I define it as a state of uncertainty as to what one is looking at in the media, content confusion. And so throughout the book, I try and provide empirical evidence that indeed people are confused. People are confused. Yeah, the disclosures don't necessarily help. They are confusing because they're not standardized. They say different things. The Federal Trade Commission, which regulates advertising in the United States, they put out a press release in 1967 and then a further statement in 1968 saying that editorial and commercial content should not be blurred and that paid content needs to clearly be stated as advertisement, as you said, that word, advertisement. And over the years, there's many different labels are used for this. Paid posts, sponsored content, right. And not everybody knows what they mean, or they don't see them because they're not always visually prominent. And so I go through many examples in the book of how we tested that empirically, did experiments, and time after time, the vast majority of people in our experiments, when we expose them to these native ads with these disclosures, they think it's news that they're looking at, a news article. So it is confusing.
Indeed. And you also use a phrase in the book that I think captures it all, which is information pollution.
Yeah. Information pollution, I borrowed as well. We stand on the shoulders of others, right?
Always.
So information pollution came from scholars in the 1980s, Cameron and Curtin. They were researching advertorials, the print advertorials of yesteryear, and referring to it as polluting the information environment, calling it information pollution. And so I did adopt that.
And again, the Times is kind of exhibit A on that kind of advertorial because when the Times was exclusively available in print, every Thursday, Mobile Oil ran an advertorial on the page where the columnists and op-ed writers had their opinion pieces. And it was, always promoting some wonderful thing that Mobile was supposedly doing, but it was every week. And you could see how any reader would become blind to the difference when it appeared with such frequency. And that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Trading on the credibility of
Right.
the Times and other
Right.
news outlets.
Which is exactly why the clients want this kind of advertising. They want it to be confused because of the Times' quality. They want the ads to be engaging and, digitally to make them spend some time with them. And I just brought a visual aid that when I'm teaching, which I teach a segment on advertising. This is, the Times in print had frequently special sections on this or that. Well, this is labeled, has the New York Times, a special section, watches. And when it was first brought to me, I was managing editor. It's like, how many news stories are there about watches that we can fill a special section with? And I refused to go along. So the business side went to the International Herald Tribune, which the Times owned at that point, and they had their reporters, right? But you can see there's the word advertising is nowhere on there.
So that whole
And look
section
at
is advertising.
the ads. It's like it had a lot of ads, but that's what they were. Watching. This was journalism created as a wraparound to ads without letting the reader know, like, what the hell is this? So that's exactly the kind of thing that you're writing about in your wonderful book. Which, by the way, we have books after our talk that you can buy and have Michelle sign, which I really recommend you do. So I basically became a real pain in the ass to the business side of the Times. And fought about native advertising, fought about other ways that ads seem to be bleeding into the news and causing pollution and confusion. But since I mentioned, the mobile ads that at a time ran every Thursday, the T Brand Studio does quite a bit of fossil fuel native advertising. And, Exxon, which is now ExxonMobil, has a real record of deception in the content of their ads. So do you see kind of the link between native advertising and the big oil and fossil fuel companies as problematical?
Absolutely, yeah. So
Could you expand a little bit?
Yeah. So, first of all, whether people recognize what they're looking at as paid content versus editorial content is a problem. And as you said, the fossil fuel companies are a big, they leverage this practice a lot. And sometimes what they're claiming in their sponsored content contradicts what's coming out of the newsroom. In certain cases, I've been doing this research with one of my colleagues here, Chris Wells, and we have a new paper out on this that's looking at this as well. It came out after publication of this. And so, the fossil fuel industry, previously there was Mobile for years was denying that climate was even an issue. So they've transitioned away from that now, and they are talking more about how we're going to continue to need energy, how energy use around the world.
They portray themselves as we're part of the solution,
Correct.
but the solutions that they promote in their ads, like carbon capture,
Yes.
are dubious, and we just don't know if they work.
And they're promoting untested technologies that, as in the Times ad that we were showing, was about algae biofuels, which they've discontinued that line
they
of
held it
research
out
now,
as
but the
having
ad is
great
still available.
promise. Right. Yeah. So even the company walked away from it, but the ad lives on.
Yes.
From doing the research for the book, I can speak for myself, but I'd love you to talk about what effect you think having, like within the Times T Brand Studio, it's like an advertising agency within the New York Times. At one point, they had nearly 200 copywriters and creators working there. What do you think it has an effect, not just at the Times, but broadly in journalism? That, do you worry about how journalists may feel working side by side with advertisers?
Yes, absolutely. So I talk about in the book how this practice is demoralizing to many journalists. I have some interviews with journalists who, they see what's happening. So some of them are afraid to report on advertisers because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds. They don't want to uncover anything that might jeopardize the relationship between
and get their bosses in trouble and get them in trouble.
Exactly. And so there's some question as to whether there's anecdotal evidence that some journalists pull punches and they write less about certain sponsors of
environmental problems and the like. Right?
Yes. There is some research that I go over where we actually found an agenda cutting effect, where we looked at across legacy news outlets, national news outlets that ran native advertisements for Fortune 1000 company. After the native ad ran, there was significantly less reporting on those companies.
Disturbing.
It is disturbing. And so, journalists see this. There's a lot of, as you know, cutting of financial constraints on newsrooms. So they're cutting reporters' jobs. Reporters are losing their jobs. And many of the opportunities to them are go to work in PR agencies or for content creation studios creating this type of work. I do want to say that there has been pushback against this. I mean, obviously, you know this because you were one of the people who was, and you and I, we don't go there. We just met today for the first time, but I chronicled what Jill was going through. She was one of the people who was pushing back against this practice and, left because of the writing on the wall.
I was fired.
Yeah,
So let's be honest.
There's been other journalists who have pushed back. Another prime example is Peter Oborne over at the Telegraph in the UK. He left rather loudly, saying that this is a deception on your readers, what they're doing, and I'm not going to stand by while this happens. And then perhaps even more shockingly is public media in Canada, CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Several years back, they launched their in-house content studio called Tandem. And their journalists revolted. Over 300 of them wrote an open letter to management saying, this is a deception on our readers. They created a web page and posted this open letter to Canadians saying this is deception, it must stop. And it was reviewed by the regulatory agency in Canada, that's the equivalent to the Federal Communications Commission that reviews the licenses of broadcasters. This is the CBC. And they eventually concluded that, well, it's labeled, so CBC can continue this. And the journalists, what could they do? So most of them are resigned to the fact that this is the world we now live in. And if you don't like it, leave.
Yeah, at this point, I want to point out that in the 17 years I spent at the Times, there was never a controversy involving an advertiser and the news we did. That would have been the publisher trying to exert some pressure, and he never would have done that. And the Times is in a special category. It's family owned. It isn't owned by Amazon, as the Washington Post is. And, or by, billionaires with conflicting, sometimes political agendas. But, I don't think, because I've asked about it, that at least the journalists I stay in contact with, I don't think they even think about T-Brand Studios. They just don't. I did have, in my waning days before I was fired, a big fight with the new CEO over whether, the professionals who worked at T-Brand Studio could then come and cover news for the Times. And he just wanted that to be okay. And then he said, oh, well, maybe we could have a 1-year cooling off period, that they'd have to have not written ad copy before they applied to the Times. And that, I wasn't, 1 year was not enough to me. And I wasn't thinking about the honesty of the workforce. I was thinking again about readers and causing the kind of confusion you write so well about in this book. If people who were, writing an ad copy one day and then covering City Hall a year from then, no. And so now I think there's like a 3-year cooling off period, but I thought there should be an impermeable wall between T-Brand Studios and the Times, but I lost out.
I do have to say that, of the different organizations that are news outlets that are chronicled in here, the Times does label their native ads
as paid posts.
As paid posts, yes. So, they do about as good a job as can be done. I've talked with journalists from other outlets where, they're aware of it. Some of them are being brought into client meetings with the salespeople. And so, the Times is doing the best job, I guess, out of all of them in terms of this. I still think it's a problem. Yeah,
and the problem is the problem for the audience,
right?
Because, I taught my class a bit about at Northeastern, a bit about native ads, and I found a paid post, a video ad for Royal Caribbean that was all about a wonderful trip to Mexico. And then I go to the travel section of the website, and what do they have? 36 hours in Tulum. And again, there really was no connection, but it caused me worry.
Yeah.
And I don't even work there anymore.
Yeah. So a couple of pieces that didn't make it into the book. This happened just this August. The Times was running, I noticed, a paid post for Pepsi. because Pepsi changed formulation of their product. I think they went to high fructose corn syrup or went away from it. I can't remember which one. And so they did their Pepsi challenge, which was famous from decades ago. And so there was a paid post about this. But then there was what seemed like a legitimate New York Times article in the
About
food
that
section
change.
about the change. Yes. And there was a second article too about how Pepsi went to the moon or something. And so in my head, I'm thinking there was probably some sort of agreement between, okay, we'll run this ad, but then there's going to be these news articles about it too. So very blurry.
Yeah, I mean, and it's blurry, not just in ads, but, number of news organizations like The Atlantic, like the New York Times, have paid conferences, where there's a very steep ticket price, and you will have, Andrew Ross Sorkin, the Times is one of their great business columnists, interviewing, let's say, Chase's Jamie Dimon. And it creates the appearance of a kind of coziness when they're sitting on stage like we are now, that I think is troubling too. It's just the digital world really changed what used to be a very tall, strong wall between news and ads. And the advertisers are buying the prestige of the publications where they're placing these native ads. The Atlantic, the Times, the New Yorker does it too. And the danger for the news companies is that these could tarnish their brand, which would be in a way the ultimate irony, right?
Well, and actually there is evidence that is happening. Right. So in some of the research that I cite in this book, we tested to see if we exposed people to a native ad and they realized it, what were their reactions to another article from that same news outlet that was not sponsored in any way. And it significantly reduced people's credibility about that unsponsored ad, an unsponsored article. So we're at a time when it's, beyond native advertising. We have generative AI making all these deep fakes. And so it's just confusing what we're seeing in the media anymore, online and social media. And so we're at a point in time where this is supposedly an opportunity where we could be turning to the prestige news outlets to sort through all this, yet they are compromised.
I mean, the book is filled with such compelling and disturbing examples, but that kind of blur, it's everywhere. I just saw this morning that Spike Jonze, who's a very good director, who made Being John Malkovich, and did lots of native ads, some of which were quite witty for Vice Media, has made a new short feature film that Gucci has underwritten the whole film. So if I see it, I'll be looking at the shoes and the clothes and the jewelry, but it's everywhere. You're right.
Yeah. So, I guess as we're wrapping things up, I'll just say that I don't want to leave everybody in a depressed state as we're finishing up, but
you want to leave them on alert.
and that's what I attempted to do in here. This is, I'm trying to help everybody become more media literate, at least with regards to this one particular practice, while also zooming out and showing how it fits into the media ecosystem that we're living in now. And, paying attention to media literacy for young people, for old people, for immigrants, for everyone, but also paying attention to public media and the public interest. couldn't have imagined that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting would have been defunded, as I was finishing this book, but here we are. So, we need to be supporting independent media. I know there's somebody here from one of the nonprofit news outlets locally here, Brookline News, which I actually call out in my book. We need to be supporting these public media. Yeah.
Great observations, Michelle. And I really do hope you read this book closely, because what Michelle has disclosed in the book, it's just, well, so you need to know about native ads.
Thank you for sharing your experiences with us, Jill.
Michelle and Jill, for a great conversation. We would love to open the floor for discussion. Questions for Michelle?
I have a question about the motivations for these ads. So obviously there's an economic space, but there's a motivation. But what is can you articulate? I mean, you hinted at it a little bit that they want, is it an insidious strategy to make the fossil fuel story more legit?
Whose motivation?
ExxonMobil.
Oh, yeah. So for ExxonMobil and the fossil fuel industry, their motivation is to borrow the halo of credibility that these news outlets lend.
And so do they pay more for this type of advertising?
Oh, yeah.
So that ad that we had up here,
Yeah.
Future of Energy ad, that was $5 million for that one ad. Yeah, so I do have figures in the book, particularly about the fossil fuel industry. Millions and millions of dollars are being spent on
That's
this.
what this watch is saying. No, seriously, it brought in millions. I mean, a full print page ad in the Times cost $100,000.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on the book and excellent insight that we heard also. Given that now we are in this state, and I was fortunate to actually hear more about native advertising through a research project that we were doing together. Given that we're in this kind of environment now, and journalists, publishers do struggle financially because no paper anymore, going digital and so on. It seems that they're in the process of course, having this as a business model now to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is the future for the publishers actually surviving, but not compromising in the way they do? How do you see this maybe ideally developing in the future so that we don't use or utilize these credibilities, the companies don't utilize them in a way to create this biasness toward the whatever is written?
Yeah, so I'm pretty clear that I think this practice needs to stop.
Right.
I think the New York Times has it right in terms of like all the expansion they've been doing in terms of games, cooking, and just, being clear that these are games. This isn't like news or games disguised as
they've
news.
always had a crossword.
Yes, yes. So, giving people things they want to consume. That's always a challenge, though. At the same time, there's certain things that we as citizens need to know in order to
Right.
make, accurate decisions as citizens.
The interesting thing about the Times' business model now is that advertising, which used to be the biggest part of revenues, has shrunk, and their business model relies on reader revenue. And that's why they've added all these products, because not only news junkies may become digital subscribers, but gamers or, cooks. So that it's been a very successful strategy. I mean, they have, I think 12 million paying digital subscribers. So that, a digital subscription costs less than the print, but it more than supports the news operations of the time. So they're not in a stranglehold.
And I know some of the new streamers like NBC is coming out with a streaming service, and I believe they're going to have an ad-free tier, which, I mean, I pay Spotify more money, so I get the music without the ads. So I think there's people out there who will pay for this content.
Eddie had a question.
Thank you both. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for the presentation. So as the only CPA I suspect in the room, first of all, I embrace independent, verifiable, and unbiased information. I think that's absolutely a cornerstone for everything that we do. So totally embrace that. But I do have a question. I learned earlier in my career this idea of just being aware of false dichotomies. This idea that many things could be in a continuum. And so, Michelle, maybe I would like to hear your perspective. Is there any positive role that this type of thing can play? Call it native advertising or whatever you label you want to put on it. Does it have any positive potential role, or is this basically your conclusion, which is we should ban it outright and it should just disappear?
I think it should disappear from news. I think you could use it in entertainment contexts. There was actually this great series that I would watch. It was called Handy. It was a short, 10 minutes episodes where it was, every episode was about this male hand model. And each episode was sponsored by a different brand. So one episode was sponsored by a watch company, and the episodes were hysterical, but I knew what it was going in, and it was entertainment. So I think, and BuzzFeed, right? They have their listicles. They don't have BuzzFeed News anymore. But I think in the entertainment sphere, okay, that's where it can reside, but not in news.
Important distinction.
I think there's a question back there.
Yeah, so we had an honor to read your book in class, and chapter 9 is particularly interesting to me when you talk about how now Google, people look at Google AI review first, and we don't know whether or not it's trained on native advertising. This morning, I found out that ChatGPT also incorporates native advertising by suggesting information and then adding ads into it right now. So you mentioned that Google, Meta, those big corporates, they offer media literacy, telling people that, hey, there's misinformation out there. But you mentioned that there needs to be actual training on that. So what's your thought on some kind of training that can be done, or whose responsibility for creating those trainings?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chi. So that Wall Street Journal native ad that we saw up here, I figured out, I did a Google search for Gen Z news consumption, and that appeared in the Google search results, and it was not designated as a native ad. It just showed up as a news article from the Wall Street Journal. So that's, I'm guessing, is how my students found that. And so, Chi, as you said, there's been announcements that some of these generative AI models are incorporating advertising into it. So yeah, we do need more media literacy training. I talk about in the book how Google does offer some modules on media literacy. Meta actually has developed some media literacy training models. But I have to ask, what are they training? There's things that they're not going to focus on. So we need to be paying attention to who is creating these media literacy training programs, and look to more independent, academy-based media literacy programs within the public schools as well. Yeah, so knowing the source is one of the foundational rules of media literacy. Good question, Chi.
I think there was a
Yeah, someone who works closely with first-year comm students here at the university, what are you telling those that are studying journalism, advertising, PR, et cetera? Like, I'm hearing that these content creation studios are poaching from other employers.
They pay well.
Okay, yeah, and I'm just, while they're still kind of here in the BU bubble, like can we get the message across to them? I mean, they have to do their own literacy training too, I'm sure, but just so that we're going to make sure that we're employing them in. I mean, are they getting kind of fooled when they kind of join certain companies or things in terms of the types of work that they're going to be doing in media, that it kind of becomes this native advertising, and maybe they weren't aware going into it? I'm just wondering what we can do with the students while they're here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So honestly, I don't know what our journalism program, I know our journalism program, and there's some professors here from our journalism program. I know nor does our advertising program teach students how to make native advertisements like this. But in terms of whether students understand the distinction, I don't know. Maybe there are some journalism students who, all the lines are becoming so blurry as to, whether you're writing branded content or not. So, hopefully journalism students understand that if you are in any other arena other than working as a journalist for a traditional or a journalistic organization, you're going to need to get client approval for whatever you write if you're not at a journalistic outlet. If you're working for a branded content studio, you're using journalistic like skills, but the client has to approve it. Here and then there.
So part of my concern is that I think for a probably larger than I'd like percentage of the population, a lot of people would rely on these articles no matter how they're branded and cheerfully view that as genuine resource. You could tell someone, I know people, who you could tell them, well, that was produced by Exxon. No, yeah, but see, they proved so-and-so. It's like, no. I mean, and on the flip side, I guess, is the profile of people who actually try to use the educational tools. I suspect that's the different part of the population. I just have this concern about, in this country, in this day and age, a lot of people almost cheerfully be happy to be fooled as long as it supports their own biases.
Yes. So understanding our psychological biases is important. I mean, I'm teaching a class. She is one of my students, and we talk about that in class, how we can be predisposed to want to engage with information that supports our current understanding of things and be more selective about engaging with things that contradict what we think we know, especially for uncomfortable issues.
Yeah, thanks.
David, had a question.
Yeah, thank you for this great conversation. I'm excited to read your book. I want to ask a somewhat contrarian question. I spent, as you know, many years as a reporter at the Boston Globe. Some 15 years ago, and this isn't Jill's fault, but the New York Times used to own the Boston Globe, and we had a banner headline on the cover of the Globe with the New York Times threatening to shut us down because the Globe was hemorrhaging at that point something like $50 million in cash. And then I remember at some point, and I certainly felt queasy about this, we started introducing native advertising. In fact, one of my former editors became the person in charge. An editor actually oversaw the paid content advertising. And as queasy and most of what was produced in that native ad was like really awful content. So it wasn't like, I didn't really worry that many people would confuse that with serious news reporting. But my question is, it sort of became clear to me that we really needed money at the Boston Globe. We were desperate to find any avenue to keep the news operation going. And now things are better today at the Globe than they were back then. But the question I have is, why ban this as long as it's clearly stated that this is advertising and it supports local news gathering? Why not keep this as a source of revenue? If it brings $5 million for like a watches thing, the Globe is obviously not, or regional newspapers are not going to get that kind of money, but it could help their bottom line.
Yeah, so great question, David. Thank you. And so Doug Most appears in here. And you're not the only journalist who feels like that. Many journalists do feel, well, if it's clearly labeled, what's the harm? But the research shows that even when it's clearly labeled, people either don't see it or don't know what it means, and therefore still think that what they're engaged, people are still deceived is the issue. Secondarily is, okay, watches, or maybe a native ad for Mass General Hospital. What's wrong with that? Okay, well, nothing, perhaps. And this isn't to say that the content in all the native ads is inaccurate. It could very well be that Deloitte ad that I showed, maybe it is accurate. But the issue is, okay, where do you draw the line? The Boston Globe used to have, and I don't know if the New York Times did, used to have a policy that they would not take any advertisements from the tobacco industry. But then suddenly they're running native ads from Philip Morris International. And so,
Because it's a food company.
but they're talking about their e-cigarettes and how it's a healthier alternative. And I listened to Ezra Klein's podcast, and I'm hearing all these ads from Philip Morris International. It's like, oh, but those aren't native ads. Those are something different. Nonetheless, there was a policy about we would not accept advertisements from tobacco companies, and now they are. And so how do you decide, fossil fuel companies, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, I believe, is on Clean Creative's F list because these news organizations are working with fossil fuel organizations and creating ads for them. So it's a tough situation.
Arunima has an add-on point.
I just wanted to respond with 3 words. Conflict of interest.
Yeah. So, your newsroom is reporting on this, and yet you're also writing ads that may contradict what's coming out of your newsroom. There's the conflict of interest.
So I know we want to continue this conversation, and we have lots and lots of questions for Michelle and Jill. Unfortunately, we are out of time. However, I have really good news. We do have the bookstore right outside, and they have many copies of Michelle's books. And Michelle very graciously is willing to sign them for you in her lovely cursive handwriting. So please, I invite you to go outside, purchase the book. If you have a book already, she is happy to sign that as well. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.